I'm grabbing it because I do believe I'm the only Protestant representative here.
Yes, it's all down to you.
And Chris is in some sense right. That is, there's no doubt that the movement, particularly, for example, in American Protestantism towards productivity. I remember reading about a point when the massive shift towards production as a value in itself. So at one point, a cigarette rolling machine was brought across from the continent, which rolled more cigarettes in one day than the entire American population could smoke in a year, and thus was advertising for it as a design to avoid deflation. As a result of excessive production, and suddenly we've moved beyond Protestantism there. I think we moved to the more complex factors in history, into issues of economics and so on. So there's no doubt that the drive to work and produce arise from a certain sense of the value and the capability of the individual, but largely that's stretched into that kind of alienation that exposed itself as moving away from biblical roots because of a lack of understanding of the way in which humans are given as not just those who represent the Creator, if I can put it that way, those who are made in His image, but also as creatures, as part of creation, who are given the task. But it would help to read not just one part of the Bible, but more bits and see how it hangs together, Chris. So, for example, indeed, and Christians at various points have misunderstood the Bible and done dreadful things, and I'll be the first to agree with that. In Genesis chapter 3, for example, when the man is set in the garden, in that narrative, however you want to read it, he's given the instruction to take care of it. That is, he's given the language of dominion employed in the Hebrew scriptures is one which is meant to reflect the idea of the godly king who does so out of benevolence, seeking the good of his subjects, and that there is a human responsibility. There is a ecological turn within Christian thought when the Bible is taken seriously, and a divergence from it when that entirely natural consumerism, which is part of human fabric across societies, actually lays waste to this fundamental Christian ethics of generosity, of the creation-centeredness as the way in which Christians are meant to bring forth the joy, the wonder, the beauty of creation for the glory of God rather than satisfying of their own material desires. That was a bit of a long answer, but
we're going to hear
just
from
shoot
Rabbi,
back.
and then we're going to move this one on.
I'll try to keep it very short. I take great pride and joy that my ancestors thousands of years came up with these stories, and many of them indeed based in Egyptian stories, Babylonian stories, whatever. But the thing that they said doesn't mean that that's how we have to live today or 1,000 years ago. What we want to do is look for their greatest insights into what it was. Remember, they were living 3,000 to 4,000 years ago in a culturally, societally, economically different place. But when they did say human beings have dominion, it was more a fact statement, and the aspirational statement was, and in that very same line, and you shall eat fruits and nuts. So we had dominion, but we weren't allowed to eat animals or wear them or anything. So it has to be seen in that broader context. And I think what we need to do is look at the stories of the Bible and remember they are relational. So they're how do humans relate to the source of being? How do humans relate to each other? How do humans relate to the environment? And how do humans relate to other animals? And does it still work is what we need to ask in the 21st century. And I'd just like to say that there's a beautiful teaching that we have that's called the Sabbath, which is 1 out of every 7 days, and it still doesn't happen. And the Romans looked at us as indolent, lazy people for having this 2,000 years ago. But it says 1 out of 7 days, just be. Everyone, stop. Now, who knows what would happen if society did that, but that place of just being is absolutely essential to the religious voice as well, and it's not about acquisition and consumerism and all those kinds of things.
One very sweet remark from Travis, then we're going to move on.
I mean, very graciously, I'll ask Swift remark. I think it's very, very, very interesting what Chris said. I mean, if you look at what David said, especially about the Protestant ethic or the geist of Protestantism, but I think if you look deeper than that, what you find in religious conceptions of the world is a rejection of the idea of plurality. And I think if you look at psychology and a healthy understanding of the mind and existence, what you need to have at its core is an embrace or an acceptance of the healthiness of plurality, of the plurality of experience, of the plurality of acceptable kind of psychological states, and that does involve to some degree, what you could call relativism. But I think psychology as a whole embraces a plurality of meaning and morality, or not necessarily morality, but moral experience as essential to healthy to healthy psychological being, and I don't think that's particularly compatible with what a religious conception of the world has. And so I don't think it's possible to, on one hand, claim that a religious conception of God is so integral to modern society, but then when we finally gain the ability to properly diagnose what is and isn't wrong with modern society, to then wash your hands of it and say, well, that's secularism. Because it's not. I think it's secularism that allowed us to properly diagnose ourselves. But I think the mindsets and the issues are, as the religious members on this panel are very keen to point out, based on Judeo-Christian theory and Judeo-Christian conceptions of the world, and how deep they are still in our society. So that's just my comment.
Our third question comes from Lewis Jackson, and it's about religion and politics. Lewis, do you mind staying?
Yep. Over the last few years in Australia, we've seen a campaign to mark no religion on the census, as well as prominent billboards from the Australian Sex Party vowing to keep religion out of politics. But we've also seen senior clerics distribute letters to their parishioners encouraging them to oppose gay marriage, and Cardinal Pell warned Catholic MPs not to vote in favour of stem cell research on pain of religious consequences. As an aspiring politician and a Christian, I'm passionate about representing all of my views and hold my beliefs about God just as sincerely as any of my other beliefs about morality or society. How does the panel believe religious views should play out in politics?
There was a movement in late 20th century philosophy, particularly promulgated by Richard Rorty, who I mentioned already. It talked about a common sense approach to public ethics. And his notion was that what you would do is when you came to any issues-centric debate, you would in fact approach it not on the basis of what people's axiomatic beliefs were, but you would simply bring to the issue what works. So when you come to think about what our divorce laws should look like, what shape our legislation should take, you would say, well, let's simply work out what works in order to drive forward. On that basis, he argued that we should exclude faith-based perspectives from politics. Now, there was a problem, unfortunately, and that approach has been rightly critiqued. The problem is this: what you think works depends on what you value. So, for example, if you think that the highest value is the freedom of the individual to do what they want as long as they don't harm some other person, then you will make it as easy as possible, for example, in the case of divorce, for someone to break that marital covenant. If, on the other hand, you believe that what matters most is the social, the familial entity, and you want to preserve that against the individual movement as much as possible, against voluntarism, then you make divorce harder because of your values. And those values themselves rest on things which aren't reasoned out. That is, we bring axiomatic principles to it from all sorts of perspectives, and religious as well as irreligious principles are equally admissible in that contribution towards values. So I think that the public square is a place where, in fact, religion and atheological perspectives should, in fact, meet not merely at the level of pragmatism, seeking what works, but rather discussing and finding common ground in those values, recognising that that's necessary for, in fact, promoting good political discourse and common shared legislation.
Abdullah, I just want to hear from you briefly on this for 1 second, because one of the challenges that I suppose Islam uniquely faces is a perception, I would say falsely, you may disagree, that Islam uniquely advocates for the integration of church and state in a way that other religions do not. What do you make in that context of how to deal with the integration of religion and politics on a personal level?
Right, well, in Australian society, it's a secular society. I think that all individuals are entitled to their personal views. Freedom of religion is a human right. And indeed, it's a human right that I can say is affirmed by both Islam and Judaism. Travis said that we're not big on plurality, but in fact Judaism has a very strong tradition of righteous Jews, and indeed the Quran says quite clearly that God created us different so that we could get to know one another and work together cooperatively. So certainly freedom of religion is critical, and likewise I guess freedom of non-religion is critical. In secular society, I guess ultimately people can kind of do whatever is appropriate for them. So I mean, if you have very strong views as a Christian, and you're going to be a politician, well, if I'm in your electorate, I would hope that you would accurately represent yourself. I think the mistake that people are making now, particularly in the political sphere, is that we're becoming caricatures of ourselves, to the point that some are even arguing that it's acceptable to say that the Prime Minister's father died of shame, or that, you know, that's freedom of speech, or whatever garbage, you know, is being presented for that. As for Islam specifically, yeah, in Islam there isn't a separation of the religious authority and the governing authority, and I affirm that completely. I think that the separation of church and state has always been pretty shaky. It doesn't make much sense to me. And indeed, in the majority of countries, there is some degree of relationship between the church and state, or the religion and the state, such that there isn't complete separation. In Israel, for example, a Jew is not allowed to marry a non-Jew in Israel, let alone talking about gay marriage. Obviously, the majority of European royal families that still exist have some ties to their respective churches, and likewise, as I said, in Islam, there is a complete connection between the religious authority and the governing authority. I don't want that for Australia, because Australia is a secular society, and the majority therefore should dictate what happens. In the Islamic world, but it's a different story. I would hope that the religious authority and the governing authorities do reunify again in this post-colonial situation that all Muslims basically find themselves in, and I would affirm that, absolutely.
You mentioned that you don't want that for Australia because it's a secular society as is, but you do want that for some parts of the Middle East as well. What makes them different?
That's right. Well, I guess what makes them different is that in the Muslim lands, and by Muslim lands I mean the nation states that are predominantly populated by those that follow Islam, there is a drive towards the reunification of the religious bodies and the governing bodies, and that's basically what the Arab Spring is all about. No matter how people try and spin it, ultimately that's what it's all about. So that's what the people there want. Obviously here in Australia, if I start advocating for the Sharia, there's not going to be too many people that will join me in that quest. So therefore I should just accept that it's pointless, and also affirm the right of every individual here to work collectively in some manner such that society functions. Obviously I don't believe in complete individualism. I'd hope that we can work together as humanity in some regard, and I don't mean that in an airy-fairy sense, but Australia is completely different to the Muslim world.
Rabbi, you've worked a lot with the army. Do you think that it's possible ever to properly achieve the separation of church and state?
Well, I think in many, absolutely not, because I think what we're talking about in terms of separation of churches and state is you don't want the government, the political entities, making decisions that affect everyone based on a specific religious tradition or teaching. And this comes back to the issue, for example, of gay marriage. Now, gay marriage is something that is opposed because of how it's read out of originally the Torah, our Bible, taken into Christianity, taken into Islam. But the conversation that happens in 21st century Australia should not be based on that at all in the political arena. And to me, that's the most important issue. In terms of, on the other hand, are you going to be able to excise religious discourse from social discourse? That's absolutely impossible. So, and that's where Mike's absolutely right. So our religious values will end up influencing those things, but no governmental decision should be based in a specific teaching or religious doctrine, if that makes sense.
Lewis, are you satisfied with that as a panel's response, or would you like to ask a follow-up?
Can I just add one thing?
Yeah, of course.
There's no division between church and state. The churches are in it up to their eyeballs in terms of how much money they take off the state. You're paid members of the state. Congratulations. You're getting the money, you know. So the connection is, of course, that the churches are under the paid aegis of the state.
Lewis, did you want to answer the follow-up?
If I could, I think what you mean is that we get we get tax benefits.
I'm going to interrupt.
Big tax benefits.
Lewis, would you like to ask the follow-up?
Yeah, so it's a little bit confusing there. We're sort of saying, yes, there should not be, the church is inherently, religious views are inherently going to find a place in the political arena, but at the same time, governments should not be legislating based on politics. It seems to be a little bit of a
Based on religious doctrine.
based on religious doctrine. Like, what if, let's say, the college has a religious doctrine? Do they remove that when making decisions?
Absolutely.
So
Let me give,
how
I'll give two examples.
Okay.
Gay marriage. All right. So you have that. It's a religious doctrine out there. Not every religious adherent of Islam, Christianity, or Judaism would be opposed to the equal rights. In fact, I was one of the rabbis who signed on to it. I know there were other ministers who signed on for the Equal Marriage Act. Now, the reason is I understand the concept of providing for marriage for people of the same sex differently than any of the scriptural issues may have been about thousands of years ago. So just to say it's against God's will, or it's written in the scripture and therefore it's wrong, that's what I'm worried about. And that's actually been much of the conversation. Marriage has always been defined as between a man and a woman. By whom? Says where? No, you're starting to privilege certain teachings within a legislative assembly, and I think that's what's dangerous, and similarly, you could argue the same thing about abortion.
I'm going to give Jason a chance to jump in on this question.
Well, as I said in my opening remarks, the Catholic Church has always been of the view that we don't need to bring claims of divine revelation directly to bear on most of these issues. And the Catholic Church, for instance, on the gay marriage issue, simply hasn't been. Rabbi Cummins makes reference to the quotations from the Torah. I have to say, with the possible exception of a very small fringe, I haven't heard quotations from any part of the scripture coming from the anti-gay marriage movement. What we've generally speaking been talking about is opposition, is the role of marriage, what role it plays within society, what good marriage plays for society as a whole, and making the case that these goods are something that are unique to the complementary relationship between a man and a woman and can't be fulfilled by a same-sex couple. Those are the sorts of arguments I've been hearing. And in point of fact, the sex party advertisements that Lewis refers to are, I think, a wonderful example of the sort of argumentation where basically if a religious person makes an argument, they don't directly reference any scripture, they make reference entirely to the sort of social good arguments that I'm talking about, and you can just dismiss that and say, oh, well, you only say that because you're a religious person. And C.S. Lewis had a wonderful caricature of that, sort of, how do you dismiss any argument which turns on this, you only say that because you're a religious person, and the follow-us up argument, how do you dismiss any argument that turns on the claim that 2 + 2 are 4, you dismiss that with the claim, oh, you're just saying that because you're a mathematician. It's not, in point of fact, as I said, it's a very good way to silence people who are coming from a faith perspective, even though we're generally speaking making our arguments in terms that do not directly rely on the claims of divine revelation.
We have to